What if I told you that Bob Marley wrote verses so revolutionary, so dangerous to the establishment, that they were deliberately cut from his recordings? That the man who gave us One Love had words so powerful they could shake governments? Today, we're diving deep into the untold story of Robert Nesta Marley, not just the legend you think you know, but the prophet whose most dangerous truths were silenced. If you're ready to discover the real Bob Marley, the one they didn't want you to hear, then hit that like button right now, subscribe for more hidden histories, and let's uncover the truth together. This isn't just music history, this is revolution disguised as melody. The prophecy in 9 Mile. In the remote hills of 9 Mile, St. Ann Parish, Jamaica, on February 6, 1945, something extraordinary entered the world. But this wasn't just another birth in rural Jamaica. This was the arrival of a soul carrying prophecies that would one day terrify those in power. Robert Nesta Marley came into existence at the intersection of two worlds. His father, Norval Sinclair Marley, a white English plantation overseer, and his mother, Cedella Malcolm, a young black Jamaican woman whose strength would become legendary. The circumstances of Bob's conception tell a story Jamaica preferred to whisper about, rather than speak aloud. Norval was 59 when he met 18-year-old Cedella. Their union was more than controversial. It was a collision of Jamaica's colonial reality with its emerging consciousness. When Norval died when Bob was just 10, he left behind more than abandonment. He left a boy caught between worlds, never fully accepted by either the privileged white community or entirely embraced by some in the black community who saw his mixed heritage as a reminder of colonial domination. But in 9 Mile, among the Blue Mountains, where the morning mist carries ancient secrets, young Bob found something else, a connection to the land that would later translate into spiritual awakening. His grandmother, Yaya, filled his ears with stories of Marcus Garvey, the black nationalist leader who had proclaimed the divinity of Africa and prophesied the crowning of a black king. These weren't just bedtime stories, they were seeds of revolution being planted in fertile soil. The boy who would become the king of reggae learned early that music was more than entertainment. It was communication with the divine. In the rural Baptist churches and the informal gatherings where African drums still spoke their ancient language, Bob discovered that rhythm could carry messages beyond words. He witnessed how music could make people remember who they were before the world told them who they should be. But even in those early years, there were signs that Bob's gift would come with a price. His piercing eyes seemed to see beyond the immediate reality of poverty and struggle. Neighbors spoke of how he would stare into the distance as if receiving messages from elsewhere. His mother, Cedella, would later recall how he would sometimes speak of things that hadn't happened yet, as if time moved differently for him. This wasn't a child destined for an ordinary life. This was a prophet in training, and the forces that would later try to silence him were already beginning to take notice. The concrete jungle awakens. When Cedella decided to move to Kingston's Trench Town in the late 1950s, she thought she was giving her son opportunity. Instead, she was delivering him to his destiny. Trench Town wasn't just any ghetto. It was a laboratory of consciousness, a place where the discarded and forgotten were creating something the world had never seen before. The government housing project, built on the site of an old sugar estate, contained within its concrete walls the concentrated essence of Jamaica's transformation from colony to independent nation. Here, in yards where multiple families shared single standpipes and where electricity was a luxury, young Bob encountered the raw material of revolution. The elders spoke of Africa not as a distant continent, but as home. The youth channeled their frustration into a new sound that mixed American rhythm and blues with traditional Caribbean rhythms and Rastafarian spiritual chanting. But most importantly, Bob discovered that his mixed heritage, which had made him an outsider in 9 Mile, gave him a unique perspective in Trenchtown. He could see the struggle from both sides of Jamaica's racial divide. It was here that Bob met Bunny Livingston and Peter Tosh, two young men whose musical abilities matched their revolutionary fervor. Together, they formed the Wailers, but they were more than a band. They were a brotherhood united by the understanding that their music would be their weapon. They practiced in the yard of Joe Higgs, a musician who had already learned the dangerous truth that reggae music, with its hypnotic rhythms and consciousness-raising lyrics, had the power to wake people up from the sleep of oppression. The three young men spent countless hours not just perfecting their harmonies but discussing the teachings of Marcus Garvey and the emerging Rastafarian movement. They realized that their generation had been born into a unique moment in history. Jamaica was about to become independent, but independence on paper meant nothing if the people's minds remained colonized. Their music would need to decolonize consciousness itself, but already there were warning signs. Record producers wanted to sanitize their message, to focus on love songs and dance tunes rather than the spiritual and political awakening they were experiencing. Radio stations would play their music but edit out verses that mentioned Rastafari or criticized the political system. Bob began to understand that his greatest challenge wouldn't be creating revolutionary music. It would be getting that music to the people without it being filtered through systems designed to maintain the status quo. The concrete jungle of Trenchtown had awakened something in Bob Marley that would never sleep again. He had found his voice, his brothers, and his mission. But he had also discovered his first taste of censorship, the first indication that his words were already being deemed too dangerous for mass consumption. The Rasta revelation. The transformation of Bob Marley from ambitious young musician to spiritual revolutionary didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual awakening that would fundamentally alter not just his music, but his understanding of his purpose on earth. The year 1966 marked a turning point when Emperor Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia visited Jamaica. For the growing Rastafarian community, this wasn't just a diplomatic visit. It was the arrival of their living God, the fulfillment of Marcus Garvey's prophecy about a black king rising in Africa. Bob was among the thousands who gathered at Norman Manley International Airport to witness Selassie's arrival. What he saw that day defied rational explanation. As the small Ethiopian emperor emerged from the plane, the crowd's energy shifted into something beyond earthly enthusiasm. People fell to their knees. Others began speaking in tongues, and some claimed to see visions. Bob later described feeling as if lightning had struck him, as if every cell in his body had been awakened to a new frequency of existence. But it wasn't just the spectacle that converted Bob to Rastafarianism, it was the philosophy itself. Here was a belief system that turned Jamaica's colonial narrative on its head. Instead of teaching black people to aspire to whiteness, Rastafarianism proclaimed their inherent divinity. Instead of promising salvation in the afterlife, it demanded liberation in this life. Instead of accepting poverty as God's will, it identified colonialism and capitalism as the sources of suffering and called for their dismantling. Bob began growing his hair into dreadlocks, not as a fashion statement but as a physical manifestation of his spiritual commitment. He adopted the Rastafarian diet, avoiding processed foods and embracing what they called Ital living, natural, pure, and connected to the earth. Most importantly, he began incorporating Rastafarian language and concepts into his lyrics, creating songs that were simultaneously spiritual hymns and political manifestos. This transformation wasn't without cost. His relationship with his mother, Sadela, became strained as she struggled to understand her son's new path. Some friends and fellow musicians distanced themselves, viewing his Rastafarian beliefs as too radical or potentially damaging to commercial success. Record labels became even more hesitant to release his music unchanged, often demanding that explicitly Rastafarian content be removed or toned down. But Bob had found something more valuable than commercial success. He had found truth. He began to understand that his mixed heritage wasn't a source of confusion, but a divine assignment. He was meant to bridge worlds, to translate the profound wisdom of Rastafarianism into a language that could reach beyond Jamaica's shores. His music would become a vehicle for spreading a message that threatened the very foundations of the colonial world order, that black people were not inferior, that Africa was the cradle of civilization, and that the current system of global inequality was neither natural nor permanent. The dangerous verses. As the 1970s dawned, Bob Marley's music began carrying messages that made powerful people uncomfortable. What started as love songs and dance tracks had evolved into something far more threatening to the established order. Musical prophecies that spoke directly to the oppressed and offered them not just hope, but a blueprint for resistance. It was during this period that Bob began writing verses so revolutionary, so explicitly critical of political and economic systems, that they would be deemed too dangerous for public consumption. The music industry, controlled by multinational corporations with interests in maintaining global stability, began implementing a subtle but systematic censorship of Bob's most powerful material. Producers would encourage him to focus on universal themes of love and unity, while quietly discouraging songs that explicitly challenged imperialism, capitalism, or neo-colonialism. Radio programmers would play edited versions of his tracks, removing verses that mentioned Babylon, the Rastafarian term for the oppressive system, or that called for specific political action. Bob's response to this censorship was characteristic of his prophetic nature. He didn't fight the system directly, but found ways to encode his most dangerous messages within seemingly innocent songs. He developed a sophisticated use of metaphor and biblical imagery that allowed him to critique contemporary politics while appearing to sing about spiritual matters. A song about ancient Babylon could simultaneously be understood as commentary on modern Jamaica, Britain, or America. But there were verses that were too explicit, too direct, too dangerous to be disguised through metaphor. These were the lines that record executives would quietly suggest be removed, that radio stations would edit out, that even some of Bob's own associates would advise against including. These censored verses contained specific critiques of named political figures, explicit calls for revolutionary action, and prophetic warnings about the consequences of continued oppression. The most dangerous of these forbidden verses often dealt with the connection between Jamaica's local politics and international economic interests. Bob had begun to understand that Jamaica's poverty wasn't accidental, but was the result of specific policies designed to keep the island dependent on foreign capital. He wrote verses that named this system, that connected local politicians to international corporate interests, that revealed the mechanisms by which colonialism had transformed into neo-colonialism. These censored verses represented Bob's most sophisticated political analysis, his deepest spiritual insights, and his most urgent warnings about the future. They were the lyrics that could have transformed not just music, but political consciousness itself. But they were also the words that those in power understood could not be allowed to reach the masses unchanged. The man who sang about one love was also writing about one struggle, the global struggle against oppression, but only half of his message was being allowed to survive. The Smile Jamaica Conspiracy. December 3rd, 1976 should have been just another concert in Bob Marley's career. Instead, it became the night that revealed how dangerous his music had become to those who preferred Jamaica's poor to remain divided and conquered. The Smile Jamaica concert, supposedly a free event to bring peace to a politically volatile nation, was actually a carefully orchestrated trap that would nearly cost Bob his life and forever change his understanding of the forces aligned against him. Jamaica's political scene had descended into tribal warfare between the People's National Party and the Jamaica Labour Party, with each side using armed gangs to intimidate voters and control territory. Prime Minister Michael Manley, aligned with the PNP, had requested that Bob perform at the concert supposedly to promote unity. But Bob was beginning to understand that both political parties were merely different faces of the same system, designed to keep the people fighting each other, rather than questioning who was really pulling the strings. 2 days before the concert, as Bob rehearsed at his Hope Road home, gunmen invaded the compound. In a carefully coordinated attack, they shot Bob in the arm and chest, wounded his wife Rita in the head, and shot his manager Don Taylor multiple times. The message was clear. Stop preaching unity. Stop encouraging the people to think beyond the manufactured political divisions. Stop using your music to wake people up to the real source of their oppression. But Bob survived, and his response revealed the true nature of his character. Despite the attempts on his life, despite the obvious dangers, he insisted on performing at the Smile Jamaica concert. Taking the stage with his arm in a sling, he delivered a performance that was both a declaration of defiance and a spiritual victory over the forces of darkness. When he rolled up his sleeves to reveal his wounds to the crowd, he wasn't just showing his injuries, he was demonstrating that truth could not be silenced by violence. The attack had revealed something crucial about Bob's role in Jamaica and beyond. He wasn't just a musician who happened to have political opinions. He was a genuine threat to systems of control that depended on keeping people divided, distracted, and disempowered. His music's ability to unite people across racial, class, and political lines made him more dangerous than any politician or activist, because he could reach hearts and minds in ways that traditional political organizing could not. In the aftermath of the shooting, Bob made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He would no longer pretend that his music was merely entertainment. He would no longer allow his most powerful messages to be censored or diluted. The forces that had tried to kill him had inadvertently freed him from any remaining concerns about commercial success or mainstream acceptance. From this point forward, his music would serve only one master: truth. The Smile Jamaica concert had been designed to silence Bob Marley. Instead, it had awakened him to his true calling as a prophet willing to die for his message. The verses that had been deemed too dangerous before the shooting would now seem mild compared to what he would create in the years to come. Exodus and exile. The attempt on Bob's life had made one thing clear. Jamaica was no longer safe for a prophet whose message threatened the established order. In early 1977, Bob made the difficult decision to leave his homeland, beginning an exile that would last nearly 2 years, but would produce some of his most powerful and enduring music. This wasn't a retreat. It was a strategic withdrawal that would allow him to create without the immediate threat of violence, while spreading his message to a global audience hungry for spiritual and political truth. London became Bob's temporary home, but it was an uncomfortable exile for a man whose music was rooted in the rhythms and struggles of Jamaica. The cold, gray city seemed to absorb the tropical warmth of his music, forcing him to dig deeper into his spiritual reserves to maintain his connection to the source of his inspiration. But this displacement also gave him a new perspective on his role as a messenger. Removed from the immediate political violence of Jamaica, he could see more clearly how his homeland's struggles were connected to a global system of oppression. It was during this London exile that Bob created the Exodus album, a work that would be recognized as one of the greatest albums in popular music history. But more than its artistic achievement, Exodus represented Bob's most sophisticated articulation of his prophetic vision. Drawing from the biblical story of the Israelites' escape from Egyptian bondage, Bob created songs that spoke simultaneously to the historical experience of African people and the contemporary struggle for liberation. The title track, Exodus, was more than a song. It was a call to spiritual and physical movement. Bob was encouraging his people not just to dream of freedom but to actively seek it, to leave the mental and physical plantations that still confined them. The song's hypnotic rhythm and repetitive lyrics created a trance-like state that allowed listeners to imagine themselves as part of a great migration toward liberation. But it was the verses that didn't make it onto the album, the lyrics that were deemed too explicit in their call for action, that revealed the true depth of Bob's revolutionary vision. These censored verses spoke directly about the need for armed resistance, about the inevitability of violent conflict between the oppressed and their oppressors, about the specific mechanisms through which colonial powers maintained control over their former colonies. During his London exile, Bob also began to understand how his music was being used and misused by various political forces. He saw how politicians and activists would quote his more palatable lyrics while ignoring his more radical messages. He realized that even his own record label was complicit in presenting a sanitized version of his philosophy to mainstream audiences, while keeping his most dangerous ideas from reaching the people who most needed to hear them. The exile years taught Bob that his true audience wasn't the music industry or even the general public. It was the oppressed people of the world who were ready to hear the truth about their condition and their power to change it. When he finally returned to Jamaica in 1978, he would come back as a fully realized prophet, no longer willing to compromise his message for commercial success or personal safety. The Peace Concert Revelation. April 22, 1978, marked Bob Marley's triumphant return to Jamaica. But the One Love Peace Concert was more than a homecoming. It was a masterpiece of spiritual theater that revealed Bob's evolution from musician to messianic figure. The concert, organized to promote peace between Jamaica's warring political factions, became the stage for one of the most iconic moments in music history, but it also marked the beginning of even greater scrutiny from forces determined to limit Bob's influence. The most famous moment came when Bob called Prime Minister Michael Manley and opposition leader Edward Seaga onto the stage, joining their hands above his head in a gesture of unity. To the crowd, it appeared to be a spontaneous act of peacemaking, but those who understood Bob's deeper strategy recognized it as something far more subversive. He was demonstrating that he, not the politicians, had the real power to move the Jamaican people. By positioning himself literally and figuratively above the political leaders, Bob was making a statement about the source of true authority. The politicians derived their power from division and conflict. Bob's power came from unity and spiritual truth. The handshake moment wasn't just about peace between political parties. It was a declaration that spiritual leadership was superior to political power. But the concert also revealed how Bob's message was being diluted and co-opted by the very forces he opposed. Politicians from both parties tried to claim association with his call for peace, while continuing to use violence to achieve their goals. The media focused on the spectacle of the handshake, while largely ignoring the deeper spiritual and political messages embedded in Bob's performance. Even some of his own songs were being interpreted in ways that supported the status quo rather than challenging it. In the months following the peace concert, Bob began to understand that his greatest challenge wasn't hostile opposition, but friendly appropriation. Everyone wanted to claim Bob Marley as their own. Politicians, religious leaders, business interests, and even international governments that saw his message of peace as useful for their own purposes. But this appropriation required stripping away the most revolutionary aspects of his philosophy, leaving only the parts that didn't threaten existing power structures. It was during this period that the most sophisticated censorship of Bob's work began. Rather than banning his music outright, which would have made him a martyr and increased his influence, the establishment began promoting edited versions of his message. The call for one love was celebrated while his critiques of one system were quietly suppressed. His spiritual messages were embraced while his political analysis was dismissed as the ramblings of a marijuana-influenced dreamer. Bob responded by becoming even more explicit in his revolutionary messages, creating verses that couldn't be misinterpreted or appropriated. These were the lyrics that directly challenged specific political and economic systems, that named the mechanisms of oppression, that called for concrete action rather than abstract love. These were also the verses that would be most aggressively censored, edited out of radio play, removed from album releases, and omitted from official biographies. The peace concert had shown Bob the full extent of his power and the full extent of the forces aligned against him. From this point forward, every song would be a battle between his desire to speak truth and the system's determination to silence or distort that truth. Babylon System and the Final Warnings. By 1979, Bob Marley had reached the pinnacle of his artistic and prophetic powers, but he had also attracted the attention of intelligence agencies and corporate interests that recognized him as a genuine threat to global stability. His music was no longer just popular entertainment. It had become a tool for political consciousness raising that was inspiring revolutionary movements from Africa to the Americas. It was during this period that Bob created some of his most explicitly anti-establishment material, verses so dangerous that they would be systematically suppressed by forces far more powerful than record labels or radio stations. The song Babylon System represented Bob's most comprehensive critique of the global order, but the version that reached the public was significantly edited from his original composition. The missing verses contained specific references to international banking systems, multinational corporations, and the mechanisms through which former colonial powers maintained economic control over supposedly independent nations. These weren't abstract spiritual metaphors. They were precise political analyses that connected local oppression to global economic structures. Bob had begun to understand that racism and colonialism weren't merely historical injustices, but were ongoing systems that had adapted to changing times. He saw how international debt was used to maintain colonial relationships, how cultural imperialism worked alongside economic exploitation, how the same families and institutions that had profited from slavery continued to profit from more subtle forms of bondage. His censored verses named these connections explicitly, creating a narrative that was both historically accurate and contemporarily relevant. But it wasn't just the content of these verses that made them dangerous. It was their effect on listeners. Bob's music had always possessed an almost hypnotic quality that could induce altered states of consciousness, but his late-period material seemed designed to awaken specific memories and emotions in people of African descent. Listeners reported feeling connected to ancestral knowledge, experiencing visions of Africa, and feeling compelled to take action against oppressive systems in their own lives. Intelligence reports from multiple countries began documenting the political effects of Bob's music. His concerts were becoming gathering points for activists and revolutionaries. His albums were being used as organizing tools by liberation movements. His lyrics were being quoted in political speeches and revolutionary manifestos. Most troubling for the authorities, his music was creating a sense of Pan-African consciousness that transcended national boundaries and political systems. The response was a coordinated campaign to limit Bob's influence without creating the martyrdom that would result from obvious persecution. Radio stations received guidance about which songs and which verses were appropriate for airplay. Record labels were encouraged to focus on Bob's more spiritual material while downplaying his political messages. Concert venues were pressured to implement security measures that made it difficult for his performances to become political rallies. But Bob continued to create music that pushed against these constraints, embedding his most dangerous messages within seemingly innocent songs, using biblical and historical references to critique contemporary politics, and developing a symbolic vocabulary that allowed him to communicate revolutionary ideas while avoiding direct censorship. These were the verses that truly revealed his prophetic vision, warnings about the future consequences of continued oppression, predictions about the inevitable uprising of the oppressed, and calls for spiritual and political preparation for the coming revolution, the Tough Gong's final battle. The year 1980 would prove to be Bob Marley's most productive and most dangerous period as an artist and prophet. His music had evolved into something that transcended entertainment and approached the realm of spiritual warfare. Every song had become a battle between the forces of consciousness and the forces of control, and Bob knew that his time to deliver his message was running out. The cancer that was secretly growing in his body seemed to parallel the growing intensity of his spiritual mission. As his physical strength waned, his prophetic power reached its peak. It was during this period that Bob recorded some of his most explicitly revolutionary material, verses that were so threatening to the established order that they would be subjected to the most sophisticated censorship of his career. These weren't just political songs, they were instructional manuals for spiritual and political revolution, containing specific guidance about how oppressed people could liberate themselves from mental and physical bondage. The recording sessions for what would become the Uprising album were unlike anything Bob had previously experienced. Witnesses described him as being in an almost trance-like state, channeling messages that seemed to come from beyond his own consciousness. He would often record multiple versions of songs, with some containing verses that were so explicit in their revolutionary content that they were immediately locked away in studio vaults, deemed too dangerous for release. These censored verses contained Bob's most sophisticated analysis of how oppression worked at psychological, spiritual, and political levels. He had begun to understand that true liberation required more than just political independence. It required a complete transformation of consciousness that would free people from the mental programming that kept them enslaved, even in the absence of physical chains. His forbidden lyrics provided a roadmap for this transformation, combining ancient spiritual wisdom with contemporary political strategy. But Bob's growing influence had attracted the attention of forces far more powerful than local politicians or record industry executives. Intelligence agencies from multiple countries were now monitoring his activities, concerned about his ability to inspire revolutionary movements across the African diaspora. His concerts were being infiltrated by agents, his communications were being monitored, and his associates were being pressured to provide information about his activities and plans. The most dangerous aspect of Bob's late-period work wasn't just its content, but its effect on global consciousness. His music was creating a sense of shared identity and purpose among oppressed people worldwide, fostering connections between liberation movements in different countries and inspiring a new generation of activists who saw their local struggles as part of a global war against oppression. As 1980 progressed, Bob seemed to understand that his time was limited. His performances took on an urgency and intensity that suggested he was trying to deliver a lifetime's worth of messages in whatever time remained. The verses that were being censored from his recorded music were increasingly finding their way into his live performances, creating a disconnect between his official discography and his actual message. Those who attended his concerts were hearing a different Bob Marley than those who only knew his music through radio and records. The Prophet's Legacy and the Hidden Truth. On May 11, 1981, at the age of 36, Robert Nesta Marley transitioned from this earthly plane, but his death only amplified the power of the message that authorities had been trying to suppress throughout his career. In the decades that followed, the systematic censorship of his most revolutionary material would become even more sophisticated, as his image was transformed from dangerous prophet to safe, cultural icon. The man who had written verses too radical for release became a symbol of peace and love, with his most challenging ideas carefully edited out of his official legacy. The process of sanitizing Bob Marley's message began almost immediately after his death. Record labels released compilation albums that focused on his most commercially successful and least politically threatening songs. Biographers emphasized his spiritual journey, while downplaying his political analysis. Even some of his own family members and former associates whether through pressure or financial incentive, began promoting versions of his story that minimized the revolutionary aspects of his message. But the truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts at suppression. In recent years, researchers and activists have begun uncovering the extent to which Bob's most powerful material was kept from public release. Studio engineers have revealed the existence of alternate versions of famous songs containing verses that were deemed too dangerous for commercial release. Concert recordings have surfaced that document Bob performing lyrics that never appeared on any official album. Former associates have begun speaking about the pressure they faced to suppress or alter Bob's most revolutionary messages. These discoveries reveal that the Bob Marley known to mainstream audiences represents only a fraction of the actual prophet who lived and created in the 1970s. The censored verses that were cut from his songs contained his most sophisticated political analysis, his most explicit calls for revolutionary action, and his most accurate predictions about the future consequences of continued oppression. They also contained his most specific instructions for how oppressed people could liberate themselves from the systems that kept them enslaved. The forbidden verses that were deemed too dangerous for release often dealt with the connections between local oppression and global economic systems. Bob had begun to understand that poverty in Jamaica was directly connected to wealth in London and New York, that the violence in Kingston's ghettos served the interests of international corporations, and that cultural imperialism was as effective as military occupation in maintaining colonial relationships. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of Bob's censored material was its prophetic accuracy. The warnings he issued about the future consequences of continued oppression, the predictions he made about the inevitable uprising of the oppressed, and the connections he drew between historical injustices and contemporary struggles have proven to be remarkably prescient. His hidden verses read like a roadmap for understanding the political and economic upheavals of the past 4 decades. Today, as global inequality reaches unprecedented levels and oppressed peoples worldwide are awakening to their power, Bob Marley's censored message is more relevant than ever. The verses that were too dangerous for the 1970s speak directly to the struggles of the 21st century. The instructions for liberation that were kept from his original audience are desperately needed by a new generation of revolutionaries. The real tragedy isn't just that Bob Marley died young, it's that his most important message was systematically suppressed, leaving the world with only a diluted version of his revolutionary vision. But truth, like a seed, can remain dormant for decades before finding the right conditions to grow. Perhaps the time has finally come for the world to hear the complete message of the prophet from 9 Mile, including the verses that were deemed too dangerous to release. What do you think? Have you ever wondered what revolutionary truths might be hidden in the music of other artists? Drop a comment below with "Forbidden Truth" if you want to see more investigations into censored music history, or share "Hidden Verses" if you think you've heard Bob Marley lyrics that seem to have been edited or changed over the years. Your engagement helps us continue uncovering the stories they don't want you to know.